Hey guys, welcome back to another episode. I'm joined again by Ryan in Chicago. We got Joe in Pittsburgh. I am here in Arlington. This is the Aerosmith listography.
Going to do a brief intro about Aerosmith and how I relate to it. I've always liked them, but I've never enjoyed them more than I do at this point in my life, having done all 15 albums in the last week, most of them re-listens. Just really enjoy their catalog all the way through. They're much better than I think most people give them credit for.
Yeah, I think they are probably America's best rock band. I was kind of surprised listening back through all the albums, how well they kind of hold up throughout. Usually, in my mind, bands have like 10 years of greatness. And I think they pushed it. I think they pretty much stayed, from Aerosmith to Pump. I think they're pretty solid, even beyond. I really, really like them, and I really like doing this list.
Yeah, I really enjoyed putting this list together. For me, Aerosmith was one of the first rock bands I got into when I was really, really young. I haven't really always, they haven't always been a band at the top of my list, but it seems like every time I check back in on them, they do hold up over time. So I'm going to get it started today. The bottom for me, this was a record. This is the only record that I had never heard prior to putting this list together. This is music from Another Dimension from 2012. There's some okay stuff early in this record. Kind of near the beginning, I thought it was going to be better than it ended up being, because there'd be like a song that I enjoyed and the song not so much, then another song that I liked, then another song that I didn't like so much. But then as it went on, the back half of the record is just all kind of garbage. All the ballads are super syrupy. Rock tracks aren't really that great. There's the one track on there called Love Her a Lot, which is just kind of a rough listen. The lyrics are awful, and the whole thing is super long. Yeah, there's not much I'd go back to, except maybe a song or two near the beginning of the record. I liked some of the tracks that had sort of the female backing vocals. I thought that was a nice introduction to their sound, something that they hadn't done a lot of throughout their career, but overall not a lot here to really enjoy.
I have Just Push Play as my number 15. I thought this was a really icky record. I hate all of the overproduction on it. There's too much rap metal. It's also got that really post-turn of the century electro pop Euro drum sound that you hear at this point in time with Dido and U2. It's kind of all over the place. I don't think the album knows what it wants to be. Even if you took away all of the overproduction and stripped the songs down to its core, there's not a lot there. I think this is a bad album. The saving grace for me is Jaded. I really enjoy Jaded. It's one of my more favorite Aerosmith songs, but this album is a pass for me, a hard pass. We'll never listen to it again.
I'm with Jason on this one. I have music from Another Dimension at my bottom, number 15. I didn't hate it, which it's not like Van Halen 3 or something like that, where it's just so awful that I want to kill myself. It's okay. I mean, it's for what it was and how kind of old everybody was when they made the album. I mean, it came out in 2012, so not really in the heyday of Aerosmith. I mean, it's not terrible. It's not good. I'll probably never listen to it again.
All right, number 14 for me is going to be Honkin' on Bobo. If you watched my Rolling Stones video when I talk about Blue and Lonesome, I put that at the very bottom of my Rolling Stones list, and I said at least it's better than Honkin' on Bobo. I was kind of being a little unfair to it. This is the first time I've gone back to it since basically it came out, and I think it's actually maybe better than the Stones record, but it's still really generic blues. The recording is it sounds good, but like really sterile. There's not a lot of life to it. Yeah, I just don't like much on this record or find it very interesting. The only track that is sort of decent is The Grind.
I got music from Another Dimension at my number 14. I agree with everything you guys said. I just disliked Just Push Play that much more. The album's way too long. The vocals are mixed in differently than any other album. Even though says From Another Dimension in the title, there's nothing out of the ordinary about this. It's a very generic album. 3 songs in particular, What Could Have Been Love, Can't Stop Loving You, and We All Found Down, are just so elementary and generic. That's really beneath Aerosmith, I think. These are songs that could be done by Train or The Calling. They're just not at the Aerosmith standard. standards. I do kind of agree with Jason that some of the first songs on the album are okay. I like Love Triple X or Love Double X or whatever it is. I think it's the first song on the album. But other than that, it's an admirable effort for a band that's 40 years old at the time, but it doesn't hold a candle to the rest of their catalog.
I have Honking on Bobo at my number 14. It is exactly what you think it is. It's aging rock stars covering blues classics. And it's fine. I mean, there's nothing terrible. I didn't find myself hating anything. The one new song is The Grind. It's not a cover, it's an original. And it's pretty good. I wish they had kind of expanded on that sound a little bit more, maybe for music from another dimension. But they didn't. Honkin' on Bobo, it's another album I'll never listen to again. But it's fine if you like that kind of thing.
Number 13 for me is Get a Grip. So as calculated as Permanent Vacation and Pump were, this album feels like it was totally focus grouped. Even the best riffs and grooves on this record seem like they're aimed at squeezing every dollar they can out of like sort of angst-ridden suburban teens hanging out in malls. Nothing about this record feels that authentic. It's just very generic to me.
My number 13 is 9 Lives. If you want to know where the band is at this point, all you need to know is that on an album called 9 Lives, the first thing you hear is Steven Tyler meowing. That's where they're at. I think this is a very rushed album. There's lots of ideas crammed into it without them being flushed out. They don't really know if it's going to be a guitar forward record, if it's going to be a nice composition and studio produced album. It's kind of all over the place. Falling in Love's Hard on the Knees is okay. It's really missing a poppy hook to it. Taste of India is really kitschy. Full Circle is a very tired ballad. I feel like at this point we've already heard this Aerosmith ballad 5 times. The album never really gets going, but there's some good guitar work and nothing is truly awful, which is why it's not higher or lower on my list. But these bottom 3 for me are not very good Aerosmith albums, although I don't think the low points are incredibly bad. So number 13 for me is 9 Lives.
I also have 9 Lives as my number 13. Sorry, Jason. I think around this time, Aerosmith kind of lost the point with their rock songs. They sort of stopped being able to write them, in my opinion. I kind of like the pop songs on here, Falling in Love is Hard on the Knees, Pink, Ain't That a Bitch is pretty good. Nothing really stood out. I thought the rockers were kind of cheesy and felt like a band, like an older band trying to capture some youth. I just don't think they are successful on it.
All right. Well, I disagree with that, and we will get to 9 Lives much later in my list. Number 12 for me is Just Push Play. I agree with a lot of what Ryan said about it. There are some good moments, though. Like he said, Jaded is great. I think it's maybe my favorite of their hits post Joe Perry rejoining in the 80s. I have a lot of the same issues with it that you had. Production-wise, there's like all those filtered vocal effects. They're trying to put in like turntable scratches. A lot of it seems kind of forced and like they're trying to remain relevant when really the song that has the least of that on the album is Jaded, and that was the biggest hit from the record.
Yeah, Jaded doesn't sound like most of the other stuff on the album, and it is a great song. My number 12 is going to be Honkin' on Bobo. I'm not really that impressed with this record, but I'd be lying if I didn't, somewhat enjoy it from start to finish. The Grind being the original cut is probably the best song on it. It's way too clean and has that big production sound to it. I do think it would have been great for this album or the style they were going for if they ever made a remake of Roadhouse with Patrick Swayze. They could have probably used this album to kind of score it as well. It's just got that kind of generic blues feel to it. That said, on Roadhouse, the band is amazing, but this kind of falls into that, kind of just clean, mass-produced, honky-tonky kind of sound. Nothing great, but I think the playing is decent on it, and I had more fun with it. It's kind of a guilty pleasure for me. So number 12, Honkin' on Bobo.
My number 12, I'm back with Jason on this. It's Just Push Play. I really like Jaded. I think we're all in agreement on that. Where I think we disagree is I like the syrupy ballads. I kind of thought Aerosmith got better at that later in their careers, as far as some of the rockers, again, they feel so forced. But I like besides Jaded, I like Sunshine, Fly Away From Here, Under My Skin, kind of the cheesy pop ballads that I thought that Aerosmith kind of gets good at this from kind of after Joe Perry joins. And I guess working with Desmond Child and all those other kind of outside producers helps. But other than that, nothing great. I don't hate it, but it's just not a classic Aerosmith album in my mind, or anyone's mind, I think.
A few minds.
Number 11 for me is Done with Mirrors. This is maybe the most sort of average or unremarkable Aerosmith record. It's hard to come up with like specific criticisms for it. There's nothing really that bad about it, but it's just like not memorable at all to me. Let the Music Do the Talking and She's on Fire are probably the standout tracks, but on most other Aerosmith records, they would be deep cuts. Yeah, it's not bad, but it's also not very good.
My number 11 is going to be kind of my cutoff point where I would recommend pretty much 11 and on up for a pretty good listen for anyone checking out Aerosmith. I've got Rockin' a Hard Place. Even though I do think this is the best sounding Aerosmith album, the bass sounds great. I'm already getting some backlash from Jason. I do like kind of the experimentation they're doing it, but I think overall it's a little uninspired. It starts off great with Jailbait and Lightning Strikes, and then nothing else on the album really lives up to it. I think they're a bit redundant by now. It sounds kind of like a repetitive record, and it sounds like they're just kind of out of gas at this point for me. I do really like Jailbait and Lightning Strikes, like I said. Nothing really terrible on it, which I think is kind of the case with Aerosmith. Their low points don't go too low because they're a really good professional rock and roll band. Not as good as 10 other albums, so number 11 for me is Rockin' a Hard Place.
For me, my number 11, back with Jason again, Done with Mirrors. It was their return from kind of obscurity. There's supposed to be, because it was the one with Joe Perry who comes back during the recording, and it doesn't have that magic. It's very generic. All of the songs kind of sound like songs that could be on Permanent Vacation, but got cut from the album because they weren't good enough. There's a couple songs like Sheila, Reasons a Dog are fine, but there's nothing, I kind of forget that this album exists, and I think for good reason. It just doesn't have anything to offer. It didn't have any big singles. It kind of just got forgotten about, and just not great. It's fine. It's number 11.
The bottom 4 on my list are the ones that I don't like very much. Done with Mirrors, I kind of feel indifferent about. Everything from this point on is kind of things I feel favorably towards. Number 10 for me is Permanent Vacation. This was their big commercial blockbuster return to form, supposedly, after Joe Perry and Brad Whitford rejoined the band. I don't love the production on it. I hate the sound of the drums. The snare drum sounds like it's in outer space compared to the rest of the band. But some of the hits are good. Dude Looks Like a Lady is cool. Ragdoll's all right. The weird thing about this record, it's pretty solid all the way through until the very end. The last 4 songs on this record are 4 of the worst songs in the entire Aerosmith catalog. It just totally falls apart at the end, which is what sort of holds it down compared to some of the other records that came around this time period.
My number 10 is going to be Night in the Ruts. It's really really good guitar stuff on it, but I don't think the songwriting is anywhere on the level where it should be. It feels watered down, and it's kind of a soft effort for them, especially after Draw the Line. I really like the guitar work on Chiquita, but the main thing that holds it down for me are 2 of my least favorite Aerosmith songs, which are Remember Walking in the Sand and Cheesecake. Just kind of hard for me to listen to. Really hate the lousy saxophone sound on Remember Walking in the Sand. I really like Jason, come on. 3 Mile Smile is great, Bone to Bone and Mia. Pretty good record, but they've got far better ones. Night in the Ruts, number 10 for me.
I don't understand at all why people think that about that album. But we'll get there.
Jason, I got some bad news for you, because coming in at number 10, Night in the Ruts.
Woo! And that's the end of the video. To hell with you.
I think my problem with this album is it comes after Toys in the Attic rocks, Draw the Line, and then this just feels like an inferior version of those albums. There's nothing new and exciting. They are in the ruts at this point, and I think at this point the band was falling apart. Joe Perry didn't even finish the album. I think the songwriting just doesn't have any cohesiveness. They were so coked out at this point that I don't think they even knew what they were playing and writing. And it just doesn't have like that killer track that kind of redeems it for me. I think Like I like it, but I don't think I could really pick out any of the songs. They're just kind of slightly inferior versions of songs they already wrote, other than Remember Walking in the Sand, which is really weird. I kind of like it, but it's an odd detour for them.
It's awesome, and I have to regain my composure here to carry on. Number 9 for me is Pump. Very similar to Permanent Vacation. It's better. It's more consistent the whole way through. I still don't like the production very much. I hate the drum sounds, but it's still one of the better albums from this like late 80s era.
I also have Pump. It's got a thinner sound than Permanent Vacation. My biggest criticism is that there's not enough guitar on it. It kind of sounds like a studio and Steven effort, and the drum does sound really bad. I don't think it starts well with Young Lust and Fine, but I think the rest of the record is pretty good. Love in an Elevator is okay. Other Side is okay. I love Janie's Got a Gun. I do kind of like how cinematic the album is. A lot of the songs have like a 1 to 2 minute kind of atmospheric intro to it, kind of painting the mood, like a mise-en-scène style to the album. I think the songwriting is pretty good, especially with the hits. The biggest drawback for me is ending with What It Takes. I don't think this song is up to par for them. This should be a Bon Jovi song to me rather than an Aerosmith song. But I do think it's pretty good. I like their late 80s, earlier 90s stuff much more than Jason does, even though he's right where they're trying to sell out to angsty, suburban teens. I think it works, and I like this album a good bit.
I'm going to predict that Joe has Pump in his top 5.
You're darn right I do. It's a fantastic album.
All right. What do you got at 9?
My 9 is self-titled Aerosmith. This one, for me, the production just kills it. It's so thin sounding. The songs are fine, but again, I don't think they really found their sound yet. It's more kind of just going through the motions of the blues. Other than Dream On, which is kind of the one standout, I think, for good reason. Mama Kin's good. There's plenty of good songs on the album, but they just, the production's too thin and they don't quite have their sound yet. It's a good debut, but it's not great.
I don't think the production's too thin. I think it's just too quiet and too muffled. I think it just needs to be brought out more.
There doesn't seem to be any low end at all on it,
well
in my opinion.
I mostly agree that the production's not that good, and that is why it's my number 8. Also, I think a bigger issue with this record, aside from the production, is the songwriting. It's just not really quite fully formed yet. They're sticking pretty much to like 12-bar blues kind of stuff for a lot of the record. I'm not a big fan of Dream On. For me, the biggest highlight of the record is Mama Kin, but it's an okay record. It's a good debut, but it's not very good compared to what they would do immediately following.
Fun note about Mama Kin, when I started learning to play guitar when I was 17 or so, Jason, you taught me this song. Is one of the first songs I've ever learned was Mama Kin, so thank you for that. My number 8 is Done with Mirrors. I like what Jason had to say, that there's not a whole lot to complain or criticize about this album, but there's also not a lot to kind of celebrate. But I do really appreciate that this is kind of their let's get back to business kind of album. They're ready to, they kind of start introducing that sound that's going to be on Pump and Permanent Vacation, kind of that big, almost country kind of honky tonk sound. I do think the biggest direction with their starting now is that Steven Tyler is going to be the highlight of the band. They're going to really take on MTV and make him kind of the main character of the act. I do think that the songs have a lot to improve on, which they will, but it's nice that they're starting to have fun. I like Sheila and Shame on You, and I think Darkness is really underrated. I think that's a cool song, and it's a good way to end. Not a lot of contenders for my favorite Aerosmith songs, but I do think that as a whole album, it's a nice change in direction and cohesive in that nature.
My number 8 is Get a Grip. I like what Jason said about it. In some ways, it's almost not an Aerosmith album, because at this point they had so many outside collaborators that I think it kind of just took the sound, the Aerosmith sound, totally out of it. It's almost sounds like, it's very Bon Jovi-ish. The rockers are trying too hard. The ballads are trying too hard. But that said, I think Aerosmith is good enough of a band that, especially the second half of the album, between like Crying, Amazing, Crazy, I think they're all pretty good songs. Nothing I wouldn't listen to many, many times again. There's something missing. They're trying too hard, too many outside producers, but it's still a good album, and it's still kind of Aerosmith, showing they still have it.
I was going to predict this very high on your list, Joe, just because it was all over the place when it came out and there's so many hits. And when I was listening to it, I totally forgot that Line Up was in the montage for Ace Ventura. I almost lost my head when that light bulb went off when I was re-listening to it.
Number 7 for me is Nine Lives. I really think this is a return to form for them. Production-wise, it sounds way better than anything they've done since Rockin' a Hard Place, really. The snare finally sounds like it's back in the room with the rest of the band. And I think the songwriting here is pretty solid the whole way through the record. I think the ballads on this record are particularly good. They're not as sort of cheesy or syrupy as they are a lot of times. Especially after this record, they'd get really sort of saccharine. But I think here they're pretty good. There's maybe 1 or 2 clunkers on the record, but overall, I think it's one of their better efforts.
We're on number 7, and this is where it gets really. I was really conflicted with my placement on these lists. My number 1 and number 2 were pretty solid, but 3 through 7 were very close to being interchangeable. It's kind of going to come down to how many songs do I really, really like on each album. My number 7 is Get Your Wings. I think it sounds better than the debut, but I don't think the songwriting is quite as good. Same Old Song and Dance is probably my least favorite of their big hits, but I do think that the double guitar attack is just as good on here as most other records. I don't think it's a great lyrical album, but I love the solo on SOS. Really good groovin rhythm record, has their early 70s sound all over it. Nothing to complain about. Favorite song is probably Seasons with Weather. It's a really good rock record. It's right in the middle of those first 4 or 5 albums that are, every vinyl owner has to, you got to have this record.
For me, my number 7 is Rockin' a Hard Place. It's the weirdest Aerosmith album because this was the one without Joe Perry and Bradley Whitford. They were fired or quit or whatever, and Jimmy Crespo took over guitar. So it kind of sounds like a Steven Tyler solo album almost. It has that Aerosmith sound still, but there's more of a reliance on Tyler's lyrics and vocals. I think he really kind of, he's the centerpiece of this one. And it's kind of a mess, but it's a really interesting mess, I think. Some of the songs on it, Lightning Strikes and Jailbait are kind of classic Aerosmith. And then it gets weird with like Joni's Butterfly, Cry Me a River, Bolivian Ragamuffin, Push Comes to Shove. They're all kind of songs you don't expect to hear on an Aerosmith album, and I think I dig them. I think all the albums after this I consider classic Aerosmith, and this is sort of like the midpoint for me. Everything before this is sort of I like, but has some flaws, and then after Rockin' Hard Place, it really gets into the classic stuff. So this is sort of the transition kind of weird album for me.
Number 6 for me is going to be Draw the Line. So this is sort of like the beginning of the unraveling of the early period of the band. So even though like on a personal level, things would get worse on Night in the Ruts and Rockin' a Hard Place, I feel like musically, this is the one that suffers the most from the turmoil within the band. I think this record's kind of spotty, even though the highs are super high. Some of my favorite tracks on any album by Aerosmith are on this record. But yeah, there's just too many holes in this record, a little too much filler. Still better than a large portion of their catalog, but not upper echelon quite for me.
My number 6 is Get a Grip. I'm really, like I said, into that sound that they're going for in that Target demo. I like kind of the wiry, high-pitched sound that is all over this, with his screeching and with the loose wire kind of guitar tones to it. It sounds more of a rock and roll effort than Pump or Permanent Vacation. I love Eat the Rich, even though there's that stupid burp at the beginning of Get a Grip. I like that song. Shut Up and Dance, Line Up. Crying and Crazy I like. They're too similar to one another. I think they should have just picked one of those. They almost sound the same to me until I hear the chorus. I can't really tell which song is which, but I really do like how even this record is. There's high energy rockers, there's more emotional ballads on it. I kind of like a lot of Joe Perry's and Brad Whitford's guitar work on it. It's different than the other stuff. It doesn't boogie as much, but I do think there's some really good difference and more of the early 90s time guitar work, and especially with the strumming and the patterns that they're doing.
My number 6 is Permanent Vacation, their big comeback album after the Run DMC Aerosmith collaboration on Walk This Way kind of blew up. This is their super MTV album. I like it a lot. I like the two singles, Ragdoll, Dude Looks Like a Lady. And I agree with what everyone else said about it. The first 9 tracks or so are pretty, solid all the way through. I think some of the non-singles, Magic Touch, Cimaraya, Hangman Jury, are all really good. Hearts Done Time, it kind of has that classic Aerosmith sound. I think probably any of them could have been singles. The album kind of debuts their first big ballad, which would be Angel, which not one of my favorite of their ballads, but it is interesting to note that kind of from this album on, they'd introduced that kind of aspect to their work. I like it. I like it a lot. I'd listen to it all the way through many times, and I will again.
All right. Well, if I didn't already lose people putting 9 Lives at number 7, this might be where I really lose people. Number 5 for me is a record that I think a lot of Aerosmith fans put at either 1 or 2. I have Rocks at number 5. It is a great record. I'm not denying it that. It has some of their best, most iconic songs, Last Child, Back in the Saddle. For me, it's just a little too straight ahead rock and roll. I think that's what people like about it, and I think that's why so many people are fans of this record. And there is a lot of great rock on it, but it just doesn't deviate. There's no like weird, interesting things. It's just like straight ahead rock the whole way through. It's great, but I like some of the weird twists and turns that some of their other records take a little bit more.
I think that's fair, and don't beat yourself up too much. You do have it in your top 5. So.
Yeah, that's good. It's a great record.
My number 5 is going to be Permanent Vacation. You guys have already talked a lot about this and hit the nail on the head. I really admire that it probably would have been easier at this time for them to kind of just embrace hair metal, and they probably would have done a decent job at it, but they're really doing what they can to make their sound their own. They're much more anthemic, and they're bringing on these big choruses and the brass instruments to it. More slide guitars, got that twang to it. I think Steven Tyler is an awesome frontman control. He's got the audience in the palm of his hand here. Ragdoll, Hangman Jury, Girl Keeps Coming Apart, Magic Touch. Love the guitar solo on Dude Looks Like a Lady, one of my favorite solos. It's awesome. It's a really good, it's probably the most pop rock record, but it's still a rock and roll record, and great from start to finish.
My number 5, I think it's one of their classic albums, but it doesn't quite reach the heights of the other ones, and it's Draw the Line. One of my favorite songs of all time, Draw the Line. I think there's a ton of good stuff on here. Kings and Queens, The Hand That Feeds, I Want to Know Why. But it does kind of, it doesn't really progress past Toys in the Attic and Rocks at all. It's still really good. I think the band is in top form. The songwriting just isn't as tight, but I feel like this is kind of where Steven Tyler really starts to sound like modern Steven Tyler. He really gets the scream and the screech going. But I think there are just a couple cracks in the songwriting and the continuity of the album. It just doesn't quite have it, and it's kind of coming after Rocks and Toys in the Attic. It's hard to put together 3 classic albums in a row, and I think this one's just a little bit off, but still really good.
Speaking of modern Steven Tyler, what's the first album that he introduces the Popeye, like, when does is it Draw the Line where that first appears, or is it a little later?
I think it's later.
Is it? Because that's like a staple of his now, I feel like.
That feels like Permanent Vacation to me, but...
Yeah, I think it is Permanent Vacation.
But he is starting to get there, I agree, on Draw the Line.
Number 4 for me is Get Your Wings. This is a huge improvement over the debut. This is sort of where the Aerosmith we all know and love sort of is really born, I think. To me, this is very much a Joe Perry, Brad Whitford showcase record. I think the guitar playing on this is the real showstopper. But that said, I think the songwriting is much improved as well. A lot of cool tunes on here. Love Seasons of Wither, Lord of the Thighs. Just a great record.
It is great. I don't think my number 4 is going to be the debut, the self-titled Aerosmith. I don't think this gets as much appreciation as it does. I think people just think it's the one with Dream On and Mama Kin on it. My favorite song on it is Make It. Kind of like a very like Deep Purple-esque mid-70s rocker. Love the drums in it. I just think that the songwriting and the composition is just really a great foundation on this album. I think Steven Tyler sounds great. I think his vocal performance on Dream On is still one of his best moments in the Aerosmith catalog. Walking the Dog is awesome. It's a great intro to that double guitar attack. It's very similar to me than Get Your Wings, even though that I think the production is better on the latter album. I do think that the songwriting is a little better on this. Love Mama Kin and Dream On and Make It. So this is why it's a number 4 for me.
My number 4, like Jason, Get Your Wings. This is the first time Aerosmith sounds like Aerosmith. Steven Tyler gets his kind of sex and sleaze lyrics going. Lord of the Thighs and Women of the World, Same Old Song and Dance. Really strong guitar work between Perry and Whitford. Everything's good on it for me. Train Kept a Rollin', Same Old Song and Dance are 2 songs I've just heard too much. They were on Rock Band or something. But other than that, I think there's a lot of kind of surprises and kind of cool songs. And I don't know, for me, this was one of the last ones I got into. So it kind of feels fresher and newer. I don't know if that influences my decision to have it at number 4. I think it's a really, really classic, really good album. The production's still a little weird. It doesn't feel full enough for me. It doesn't detract from the greatness, I think.
I feel like chronologically, for the first 5 albums, the production gets better each time almost.
Pretty much.
Disagree.
You would.
Number 3 for me is Rock in a Hard Place. I do not even understand, and I have never understood why people don't like this album that much. I hear the arguments that like the magic's gone without Joe Perry and Brad Whitford, but I think Jimmy Crespo and Rick Dufay come in and absolutely nail it. I think it's just as good as anything the band had done prior. I don't think there's a weak track anywhere on the album. I think the production is still solid, and yeah, I love this record. I've always loved this record. I'm not hearing what other people are hearing as its weaknesses.
Well, that must be nice. It is an album. Number 3 for me is Draw the Line. I know this is kind of when they first started to go off the rails, and I think there's an abnormal amount of criticism on this album, especially from the band themselves. I don't get it. I love this album. It is a bit of a departure from what they were doing before. There's a lot less of the boogie and kind of that, boozy bar rock kind of feel to it. They're embracing more of like a heavy New York Dolls, like club scene kind of vibe, and I really like it. It's a statement album. It's heavy. It's got power. It's also getting a little more dramatic and glammy at the same time. Draw the Line, Critical Mass, Get It Up, Kings and Queens, The Hand That Feeds, Sight for Sore Eyes. I love all of those songs. The only reason why it doesn't compete more competitively for 1 and 2, it has my least favorite Aerosmith song, which is Bright Light Fright. Can't stand that song. It kills it for me. It's at least right in the middle of the album, so you have a bathroom break that you can utilize if you don't have to. But
we haven't talked about it yet, but I don't understand why they keep letting Joe Perry sing. He sings 2 on the newest record. Music from Another Dimension. He's a terrible singer. He's one of, as far as like secondary singers and bands go, he's one of the worst.
I would probably agree with that, especially because I love Steven Tyler, so I don't understand why you would take that away from Aerosmith. He is better than Eddie on, he sings the last song of Van Halen 3, right? We talked about that. Yeah, Perry's better than Eddie. So Draw the Line, a really strong number 3 for me, one of the best rock and roll records.
My number 3, and I don't understand why it's so low on your list, is Pump. I love Pump. I think it is the classic 80s sound for Aerosmith. Every song on here, every song on here is almost perfect as far as how they reinvented themselves. They actually peeled back some of the collaborators from Permanent Vacation. That's more Aerosmith writing the songs themselves. I love Young Lust, Fine, Love in an Elevator, Monkey on My Back, Janie's Got a Gun, The Other Side, My Girl. I think it's remarkably consistently good. I think the vocals sound incredible. Steven Tyler's top of his game. The guitar solo on The Other Side is one of my favorite Joe Perry's. I think it has the best ballad of all the Aerosmith songs, What It Takes. I do like the way it closes out the album. For me, the singles are great. The non-singles are great. I just think it kind of a ridiculously return to form almost. By this time they kind of had already had a reinvention, but I think this is kind of the pinnacle of that reinvention for them.
Even though I do have it lower on my list, I do agree that Steven Tyler sounds awesome all over this album.
Thank you.
I agree as well. My number 2 is Night in the Ruts. Very similar to what I said about Rock in the Hard Place. I don't understand people's distaste for this record. I think this record comes out guns a-blazing with No Surprise and Chiquita. I love Walking in the Sand and Cheesecake. If anything, there's maybe one weak song on this record, which would be Reefer Headed Woman. But for the most part, I think this record absolutely slays. I think the mix is great on this record as well. It might be my second favorite sounding Aerosmith record. Yeah, I love it.
Number 2 for me is Rocks. Like Jason was saying, this is a very popular choice for 1 or 2. So no surprises in my 1 or 2. Rocks is everything you said. It's just a straight up great rock and roll record. The guitar is amazing. The grooves, it's fast. It's got just a lot of really good jam on it. The rhythm section combined with the guitar is never better than it is here, or my number 1 pick. Back in the Saddle, Last Child, Nobody's Fault, Licking a Promise. I love all of this stuff. This sound with Rocks and Toys in the Attic is just to me kind of like almost like the showcase of that mid-70s rock radio sound, and I absolutely love it. The main thing that holds it back from out of the number 1 spot is how much I love my number 1 spot. And I do think a little bit of Rocks is repetitive of itself. A couple of the songs that I like least sound a lot like other stuff on the album. Combination at times sounds exactly like Back in the Saddle, which kind of dampens it a little bit for me, but it is a great rock and roll record. Like what you were saying when we did Van Halen, where you said if aliens came to Earth and needed to test out what rock and roll is, Van Halen 1 might be the album to give. I feel like this is also kind of a good representation of what really good rock music is. So Rocks, number 2 for me.
My number 2, and I went back and forth on this. It was very extremely razor thin close, but it is Rocks, like Kramzer's. Back in the Saddle, Last Child. I think the singles are superior to Toys in the Attics, but I don't think the rest of the album is quite as strong as Toys in the Attic. There's one song in particular on Toys in the Attic that kind of elevates it for me. But other than that, I mean, Back in the Saddle is my favorite, spoiler alert, Aerosmith song.
Me too, double spoiler alert, double spoiler.
The sound that they get on that is like, I mean, it is rock and roll almost for me, especially the 70s sound. It's perfect between Steven Tyler and Joe Perry. I think it's the pinnacle of their playing. And for me, there's not a weak cut on the whole album, but it's just not quite as strong as Toys in the Attic. So that's why it's my number 2.
Well, it looks like we're all at number 1 here.
For the first time.
Maybe on anything ever, to be honest.
Yeah, this might end up being the only listography we do where we share number 1.
For me, it was not even remotely close. As much as like I love all those other Aerosmith records, like my probably like 6 through 2, they're all kind of tight and close together. This is miles and miles ahead for me. There's just a vibiness to this record. Like it's got this like undercurrent of like dark seediness to it that I love, and that is kind of missing from the more straight ahead Rocks. This was one of the first like hard rock records I ever got into as a kid. And even through life, as I've gotten into different types of music and haven't always been listening to that much Aerosmith, every time I check back in with this record, it's like, yeah, it holds up completely, like doesn't diminish at all. I think this is one of the best. As far as like hard rock or like rock with a capital R goes, I think this is about as good as it gets.
It is. It's damn near perfect. It is probably in my top albums of all time. It is seedy. I like that verbiage. I really think there's like kind of this quiet confidence with how tight they're playing on this record. You hear it right off the bat with Toys in the Attic. Walk This Way and Sweet Emotion are awesome. No More, No More, You See Me Crying. My favorite thing about this album is they are such a rock and roll band and a fan of rock music that you can hear so many influences that aren't even really that old. You can tell they're really into different scenes and they like to kind of play into what they like. You can hear Yardbirds and Zeppelin and Stones and Deep Purple and New York Dolls and all of this stuff that they allow, but they're never not themselves. They're never a ripoff. You know, such a good jangly boogie to their early sound, and this one is a little more cocky. You know, they have their sound down and they play it so well. Not a weak refrain or bar on this record. It is good. It's the perfect length. It's probably about 30-35 minutes. It is great all the way through. 5 out of 5 stars. So good.
Yeah, my number 1 also Toys in the Attic. It really is. You know, if Get Your Wings was kind of them finding their sound, Toys in the Attic is the culmination of kind of all the elements into what makes Aerosmith great, I think. Perfect vocals. It does have that kind of menace to it, which you can see right on the album cover, really. It's dark, it's seedy, it's a little discomforting sometimes. And I love the way it progresses, and then they hit you with one of my favorite songs, You See Me Crying, at the end, which is such a 180 kind of from what they had ever done. And really, I mean, it's almost, it's pretty unique in their whole catalog as far as the way it progresses and the way it sounds. And I think it's just a perfect capper to pretty much a perfect album.
Yeah, it's perfect is pretty much the best word for it. It got great momentum. Everything's placed perfectly. It's awesome.
Well, that does it for another episode of Listography. We hope you enjoyed it. Hit the like button if you liked it. Subscribe. Make sure you're signed up to get the notifications by hitting the bell. And we will be back soon with our top 10 songs. We'll see you then.